The rain had not stopped against the tall library windows when the door at the far end of the room opened, and a man walked in who had been buried at sea 11 years before. For a moment, no one in that long, book-lined room moved. The solicitor stood at the head of the reading table, with the late Duke's testament half unfolded in his hands. His spectacles slid low, his voice arrested mid-syllable. The fire cracked once, and then seemed to hold its breath with the rest of them. Winifred Pelham, seated against the wall where a paid companion was meant to sit, felt her own heart climb into her throat and stay there, beating where she could not swallow it down. The stranger came forward into the candlelight. He was perhaps 35, dressed in mourning black that fit him a little too well for a man supposed to have spent a decade lost to the world. He looked about the room as a man looks at a thing he means to own. And then he said the name that had been carved into the cold marble of the family chapel since before Winifred had ever come to this house. He said that he was Valentine. He said that he had come home to claim what was his. If you have ever sat in a room where the dead are spoken of with reverence, and then watched a living mouth claim their name, you know the particular silence that fell. Hold it with me a moment, because everything that followed was decided inside it. Then the silence broke, and the room began, very quietly, to take sides. To understand why a woman of no fortune and no name sat trembling against that wall, you must go back 6 months to the 3rd week of her service, in the house of the Duke of Harrogate. She had come to Harrogate Hall in the wet end of autumn, hired to read to an old man who was dying and knew it. The agency in the county town had described the position in 3 lines. A gentlewoman of education was wanted, patient of temper, easy of voice, to sit with his grace through the long evenings and read to him from whatever he chose. The wage was small. The house was remote, set among the bare oaks and grey stone of the north, where the wind came off the moor and found every gap in every window. Winifred had taken it because she had nothing else, and because a woman of 26 with neither dowry nor protector learns to be grateful for a roof and a fire and a use for her days. She had buried both her parents and most of her prospects by the time she arrived. Her father had been a clergyman, with more books than living, a gentle man who had taught his daughter Latin and the pianoforte, and a great many things that did not feed a person, and who had left her on his death a small trunk of those books and the manners of a class she could no longer afford to belong to. She knew which fork. She knew how to enter a drawing room. She knew, too, the particular shame of knowing these things while wearing a gown turned twice at the hem and gloves mended at the seam. The world had a word for women like her, and the word was useful, and useful was a short walk from invisible. The old Duke was named Edrich, and he was not at all what she had feared. He was sharp where she had expected querulous, and kind in the gruff, sideways manner of men who have spent their lives among horses and tenants and account books. He had outlived his wife, and he believed both his sons. The elder, Valentine, had gone to sea against his father's wishes as a young man, and had been lost when his ship went down off a foreign coast. No body recovered, only a letter from a captain, and a long, slow grief that the old man had never set down. The younger Benedict had taken the title in his brother's place, and the title had taken something out of him in return, for he kept to his own wing of the house and rarely came down. In those first weeks, Winifred read to his grace from the histories he loved and the psalms he loved more, and she learned the house the way a servant learns a house, from its edges. She learned that the old Duke kept a worn psalter by his bed, its spine cracked, its margins thick, with a young man's handwriting. She learned that he made her read one psalm from it every night, the same one, the 121st, lifting up his eyes unto the hills, and that he could recite it with her though his sight had nearly gone, and that when they reached the last verse his voice would catch on a word she did not yet understand. She learned that he kept a silver christening cup on the mantel, dented on one side, and that he would turn it in his hands when he spoke of Valentine, who had thrown it across a nursery, in a temper at 4 years old, and dented it forever. She did not yet know that these small, worn things would one day stand between a stranger and a stolen name. She only knew that she had come to love the old man who turned them over in his hands. The first time she met Benedict, the Duke of Harrogate, She did not know it was him. She had gone down to the library after midnight to find a particular volume the old Duke wanted, expecting the room dark and empty, and had found instead a man standing at the cold hearth in his shirt-sleeves, with a glass untouched in his hand. He was tall and broad through the shoulder, dark-haired, his jaw set hard as carved stone, his eyes, the gray of weather coming in off the moor. He turned when she entered, and looked at her without warmth and without welcome, and she dropped a curtsy and begged his pardon, and reached past him for the book. And he watched her do it without a word. Only when she had reached the door did he speak, and what he said was, "Come away from the window. The draught there will give you cold." She had not been near the window. She understood much later that it was the only kind of tenderness he knew how to offer. An order dressed as indifference, a care he could deny if it were named. To the household the young Duke was cold. To the season's gossip, carried up from the assembly rooms by the housekeeper, he was the proud, hard Duke who would not dance, and would not court, and would not be drawn. The man who had inherited a great estate and a great grief. Lady Lockhart, his late father's sister, who had installed herself at the hall the moment the old Duke took to his bed, said it more plainly than anyone. Winifred heard her say it on the stairs to the solicitor, not troubling to lower her voice, for she did not count the listener worth, lowering it for she is only the reader. Lady Lockhart said, "Pay her and be done." The companion is the kind of woman who attaches herself to a dying man and hopes to be remembered in the will. Winifred had stood very still on the landing above, and let it pass over her, because there was nothing to be done with it but let it pass. She had learned that too. The old Duke died on a grey morning in the last week of the year, with the 121st Psalm read out to him for the last time, and his cracked psalter in his hand. He had pressed it on her the night before the worn book, and told her to keep it, that she would understand one day why. She had wept for him as she had not wept for anyone since her father. Alone, in the cold little room they had given her under the eaves, and she had thought that her time at Harrowgate Hall was over, that she would be paid her wage and sent back to the agency and the next dying stranger. She did not know that she had been named in the will. She did not know that the old man had left her a small annuity and a single sentence of instruction that would set the whole house against her. And she most certainly did not know that within the month a dead man would walk through the library door. The will was to be read in the new year, when the roads cleared, enough for the family's man of business to come up from the county town. Lady Lockhart took charge of the arrangements as she took charge of everything, sweeping through the morning house in her black silks and her cold diamonds, ordering this and forbidding that, and she made it known by 100 small means that the reader was no longer wanted. Winifred's meals were sent up later, and, colder, her fire was let go out. Mrs. Gorse, the housekeeper, a broad, kind woman with chapped hands and a soft heart, brought her warm bricks for her bed when no one was looking and told her, lo, that it would not be long now, that she should keep her head down and take her annuity if she was lucky enough to have one and go. But then the letter came. It came addressed to the house in a hand no one living recognized, and it claimed to be from Valentine. It said that the report of his death had been false, that he had survived the wreck, that he had been these 11 years in the Indies and in the Americas, ashamed to return a failure to a father who had cast him off, and that, hearing of that father's death, he was coming home at last to claim his birthright. Lady Lockhart read it aloud at dinner with her color high and her voice ringing, and Benedict sat at the head of his own table and went very still, the stillness of a man who has been struck where an old wound never healed. Winifred sat as always at the foot of the room, watched his hand close slowly around the stem of his glass, until she thought it would break. She had learned to read him by then. She knew that what looked to the room like the cold Duke unmoved was in truth a man drowning. The stranger arrived on the morning the will was to be read, and so it was that he walked into the library in the middle of the solicitor's first sentence, and so it was that Winifred found herself once more pressed against the wall, watching a man claim a dead son's name in a dead father's house. He was good, She granted him that from the first with a cold, clear part of her mind, that her father had trained and that grief had never quite put out. He was good at it. He had the bearing, the black coat, the weathered face of a man who has been at sea and abroad. He told a story of the wreck and the long years after that hung together at every joint, and he wept at the right moment. And when Benedict rose from his chair and crossed the room and stood before him searching his face for the brother he had buried, the stranger said, "Ben, you have grown old," in a voice rough with feeling. And Winifred saw the young Duke's hard jaw tremble like a boy's. Lady Lockhart was at the stranger's side within the hour, and that was the first thing that was wrong. For Lady Lockhart had buried Valentine more completely than anyone. She had spoken of him for years as a cautionary tale, the wild son, the disgrace, the boy who broke his father's heart by running to sea. She had no love for his memory, and had said so 100 times. And now she received this stranger like a returning prince, took his arm, called him nephew, and began at once to speak of how the estate must be set in order, how the years of Benedict's stewardship would of course be reviewed, how everything must go to the elder son as the law and nature intended. Winifred watched her move through the room, arranging the men in it like furniture, and understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, that whatever this stranger was, Lady Lockhart had been expecting him. What she did not understand yet was why a woman, so proud of her blood, would set a false heir over the true one. That came later, in pieces. It came when she learned that Benedict had refused that autumn to let his aunt's chosen man manage the Harrogate rents, that he had begun quietly to question the accounts she had kept during his father's long illness, that there were sums in those accounts that did not add. A young duke who looked too closely at the books was a danger to Lady Lockhart. An elder brother returned from the dead, grateful and pliable and entirely in her debt for his welcome, was a duke she could manage. She did not want Valentine alive, because she loved him. She wanted a duke she could lead. The household took the stranger's side, because the household wanted the wonder of it. The dead returned, the story to tell. The solicitor missed her too. Allardyce took his side too, or at least did not oppose it, for the letter had come with documents, a ship's paper, a foreign marriage line, a seal pressed in red wax that matched the family seal closely enough to trouble an honest man and satisfy a frightened one. And Benedict, who wanted more than his life to believe that his brother was not dead, who had carried for 11 years the guilt of the younger son who lived while the elder drowned, Benedict began to believe. Only Winifred did not, and Winifred was only the reader, and no one had asked her. She might have stayed silent. A wiser woman in her position would have taken her annuity and gone before the storm broke over the house. She had sat 6 months at the side of the old Duke, though, and she had heard him speak of Valentine on 100 long evenings, and the stranger in the library did not match the boy the dying father had grieved. The mismatch was small at first, a wrongness she could not name. The way a familiar tune played a half-tone off will trouble the ear before the mind knows why. Then it began to have edges. The stranger wrote his name for the solicitor, signing a paper of acknowledgment, and he signed it with his right hand. Winifred, pouring out the tea she had been permitted to pour because no one thought a servant worth excluding, went very still with the pot in her hand. For the old Duke had told her on one of their last evenings, laughing in the dry way grief allowed him, that Valentine had been left-handed since the cradle, that his tutors had beaten the boy's right hand raw, trying to mend it, and never managed, that the only letter he had ever received from his lost son had been written in that wrong-handed slope he would have known anywhere. The man at the table wrote with an easy, practiced right hand. It was nothing. It was everything. She set the pot down before it could shake. She watched after that the way her father had taught her to read a difficult page, slowly, twice, without deciding in advance what it said. She watched the stranger turn the dented christening cup in his hands when Benedict, his voice breaking, set it before him, and she watched him say the right tender things about a nursery temper he could not possibly remember. And she saw that he turned the cup to admire the chasing on the sound side and never once let his thumb find the dent. A boy who had thrown that cup would have known the dent the way he knew his own thumbnail. This man found the pretty side, and stayed there. And she watched him at chapel, when Benedict, grasping at the only ground he trusted, asked his brother to read the old psalm, their father's psalm, the 121st. From the cracked psalter the family had used for 3 generations. The stranger took the old psalter and opened it and read the words in a fine, carrying voice. Every word correct, for the words are printed in every psalter in England. The old Duke's psalter, however, had a 4th thing in it that no printed page could give a stranger. In the margin beside the last verse in a boy's cramped hand, someone had long ago written a single line, a private joke or a private prayer between a father and his elder son, and the old Duke had told Winifred its story on the last good evening of his life, and had made her promise to read it with him that night. The stranger read the printed verse, and turned the page. He did not read the margin. He did not know the margin was there. Winifred carried these 3 small wrongnesses inside her for a week, like stones in her apron, and told no one, because there was no one to tell who would not laugh, and because to be wrong about this, to be the grasping reader who tried to ruin a family's joy for her own ends, would be the end of her. And then, on a night when the house was asleep and the wind was loud, she went down to the library to return a book, and found Benedict at the cold hearth again, exactly as she had found him on her first night, a glass untouched in his hand, his face in the firelight, no longer hard at all. Some quiet things deserve to be sat with before they pass, and this was one of them. You might sit in it a moment, too. The young Duke looked up and saw her, and for once did not order her from the window. He said her name. He had never used it before. In 6 months he had called her Miss Pelham when he was obliged to call her anything. And now, low and rough, into the dark, he said, Winifred, and she stood with the book in her arms and understood that he had reached the bottom of something, that the man who had refused all winter to be drawn had been drawn at last by the one thing that could move him, the hope that his brother lived, and that the hope was tearing him in 2. He said, You do not believe him. It was not a question he had read her too, all those months, as carefully as she had read him. She might have softened it. She did not. Her father had taught her that a true thing said gently is still a true thing, and that the gentleness is for the hearer, not the truth. She told him about the right hand and the left. She told him about the cup and the dent his brother had made and the stranger's thumb that never found it. She told him about the margin in the psalter that the dead old man had loved, and the living stranger had not known to read. She did not tell him what to conclude. She laid the 3 small wrongnesses before him the way she would lay out a page, and she let him read it. He was silent for a long time. The fire had burned low and neither of them moved to mend it. When he spoke at last, his voice was the voice of a man choosing, with his whole weight, whether to keep a brother he had buried or lose him a second time, on the word of a paid companion who might want only to be remembered in a will. He said, If you are wrong, you will have taken from me the one good thing this year has held. And she said, I know it. And he said, And if you are right. He did not finish it. He looked at the worn book in her arms, the very psalter, for she had carried it down without thinking, and something crossed his hard face that she had no name for. And he said, You loved him, my father. You loved him better than his own blood did. And she found she could not answer that, and the not answering was answer enough. It was the nearest they had ever stood. It was the nearest, she thought, that a duke and a reader could ever stand. The clock struck and broke it, and she went up to her cold little room and lay awake until the gray came, certain that she had ruined herself and not sorry. She had not ruined herself. Lady Lockhart did that for her, and did it well, for Lady Lockhart had not built her whole design to be undone by a servant with 3 small doubts. The aunt moved the next morning, and she moved like a woman who had foreseen this exact danger and prepared the ground for it. She did not argue with Winifred's doubts. She did something far cleverer. She made Winifred the danger. By noon it was known through the whole house, carried on the soft current of servants' talk, that the reader had been seen alone with his grace in the library after midnight, that the grasping companion, who had wormed her way into the old Duke's will, was now setting her cap at the young one. That she had begun whispering poison against the returned heir because a false Valentine, controlled by herself, would serve her better than a true one. The story was a mirror of the truth turned exactly backward, and it was perfect, and Winifred could not answer a word of it without making it look more true. Lady Lockhart summoned her that afternoon to the morning room where the false Valentine sat at his ease by the fire, and the solicitor stood unhappy by the window, and she said the second thing, the public thing, the thing meant to be heard and repeated. "What?" she asked the room. "Can the reader possibly know of this family?" She said it with a small, cold smile, turning the question over for the men to admire. "A paid companion of half a year," she said. "Against 11 years of a son's own suffering and a mother's own sister's certainty." She offered Winifred money, then openly before witnesses, a sum that was meant to look like generosity and was in truth a brand. She named a figure that would have kept Winifred in modest comfort for years, and she laid it out as severance, as kindness to a faithful servant, on the single understood condition that the faithful servant pack her trunk that evening and carry her doubts out of the county and never speak them again. It was a great deal of money to a woman who had none. Winifred looked at it on the table between them, the bank paper crisp and clean, and she thought of the turned hem of her gown, and the agency, and the next dying stranger, and the long, cold years a sum like that would soften. And then she thought of the old Duke turning the dented cup in his hands, and of the margin in the Psalter that he had made her promise to read, and she heard herself say quite steadily that she could not take it, because it was offered for a silence she did not have to sell. She said that she had no certainty to give them, only what she had seen and heard at his Grace's side, and that they might weigh it as they liked, but that she would not be paid to unsee it. Lady Lockhart's smile did not move, but something behind it did. A flicker of the calculation of a woman discovering that the cheapest tool on the board would not be bought, and Winifred saw it, the single cold instant of it before the smile sealed over again. She was dismissed from Harrowgate Hall by nightfall. There was no scene. Lady Lockhart did not need a scene. Mrs. Gorse came up to the little room under the eaves with red eyes and helped her fold the few poor things into the trunk, and told her in a whisper, as if it could still cut to say it aloud, that Lady Lockhart had been heard to call her a reader who had forgotten her place, a companion grown above herself, a woman who would be doing the family a kindness by being gone before the heir was confirmed. 3 times now the word had been laid on her, in the corridor and in the morning room, and now in the kitchen passage carried up by a weeping housekeeper, and each time it had meant the same thing, that she was nothing, that her seeing did not count, that the verdict of the room had been rendered, and she was not in it. She went down the back stairs in the dark so as not to trouble the family. The young Duke did not come to see her. Go she told herself she had not expected him to. She told herself it on the whole long, cold walk to the village inn, and she did not once believe it. And the not believing was the worst thing she carried out of that house, heavier than the trunk. She did not go. That was the thing none of them had reckoned on, least of all herself. She had money enough from her quarter's wage for 2 nights at the inn and the coach south, and she sat in the low-ceilinged inn parlor with the coach fare in her glove and could not make herself buy the ticket. For she had promised a dying man to keep his book and understand it, and she did understand it now. She understood that the old Duke had pressed the Psalter on her, and named her in his will, and told her she would know why. One day, because he had known with the last clear part of him that a storm was coming for his house, and that the only honest witness left in it would be the reader. He had armed her. He had handed her the one weapon a false heir could not forge, the worn private memory of a real son, and she had nearly carried it out of the county in her trunk to oblige the woman who wanted it gone. She took a room for one more night. She wrote one letter in her father's careful hand to the solicitor, Mr. Frofton. Allardyce, who had stood unhappy by the window and not opposed her and not helped her, and who was, she had judged, an honest man in a frightened position. She did not accuse. She asked. She asked him 3 questions, plainly. About the right hand, and the cup and the margin, and she asked him to put them to the heir before the will was finally settled and the estate signed away. Not for her sake, for she had no standing and wanted none, but for the sake of a dead man who had trusted his name to honest dealing. And she sealed it and paid the inn's boy to carry it up to the hall. And then she sat by the small fire and waited, with no certainty at all that any of it would matter. It mattered because Benedict had not slept either. The young duke had spent the days since her dismissal in a war with himself that no one saw, for he had been schooled all his life to let nothing show. He wanted his brother alive. He had wanted it for 11 years with a hunger that had hollowed him out, and a stranger had come and offered to fill the hollow, and all he had to do to keep the brother was to disbelieve the reader and look away from 3 small wrongnesses. He had very nearly done it. The reader, though, had stood in his library at midnight and refused to soften the truth, and then had refused, before witnesses, a sum of money that would have changed her life. And a woman who refuses such a sum to keep a doubt is not a woman setting her cap or worming into a will. He had watched his aunt offer the bribe through the morning-room door. He was not meant to be behind. And he had watched the reader push it back across the table, and in that moment the whole of Lady Lockhart's careful mirror had cracked down the middle, because the one fact it could not contain was a poor woman who would not be paid. When the solicitor brought him Winifred's letter with its 3 plain questions, Benedict read it once, and then he did the thing his father's son was bred to do. He did not rage. He set a test. The will was to be finally read, and the estate conveyed 2 days later, and the family, and the household, and the false heir all gathered again in the long library where it had begun, with the rain once more against the tall windows as if the year meant to end exactly as it had threatened to. Lady Lockhart was there in her diamonds triumphant, the conveyance ready, the false Valentine at her side in his well-fitted black. And Benedict had sent the inn's boy back with a single line, and so Winifred was there too, brought up from the village in the Duke's own carriage, standing once more in the reader's place by the paneling, with the worn psalter held against her like a shield. Lady Lockhart saw her, and her face closed like a fan. "What," she began, "is the reader doing?" "The reader," Benedict said, and his voice was very quiet and the room went quiet to hear it, "is here at my asking." He did not look at his aunt. He looked at the man who called himself his brother, and he said, "Before we sign, brother, indulge me in 3 small things, for the sake of our father, who loved ceremony." And the false Valentine, who could not refuse without looking afraid, inclined his head and smiled and said that, of course he would. Benedict laid a pen and a paper on the table and asked him to write their father's name. The stranger took up the pen in his right hand. Benedict watched him do it and said nothing, and Winifred, at her place by the paneling, saw the Duke's jaw set, for he had not been certain until that instant, and now he was. Then Benedict took up the dented christening cup from the mantel and set it in the stranger's hands and asked him, lightly, as if it were a game, to show the company the mark he had made on it as a boy in a temper, the famous dent the whole nursery had talked of for 30 years. The stranger turned the cup. He turned it the wrong way first, to the sound side, and his thumb searched the smooth silver for a dent that was not there, and the searching went on a half-second too long. And a half-second was all it took. A flush climbed his weathered throat. Lady Lockhart said sharply, "This is a child's game. A man does not remember every scratch of his nursery." But her voice had gone a half-tone high, the way a familiar tune goes wrong. And the room heard it. Then Benedict held out the worn psalter, the old Duke's own, that Winifred had carried down the back stairs and nearly out of the county, and he asked the stranger to read the last verse of their father's psalm, as their father had taught it to them both. And the room waited. The stranger took the worn book. He found the place. He read the printed verse in his fine carrying voice, "The Lord shall preserve thy going out, and thy coming in." And he closed the book, and he looked up with the small relief of a man who has cleared a fence. And Benedict said gently, "You have left out the part our father loved best." He took the book back from his brother's hands, and he turned it so the whole room could see the margin. And he read, in a voice that shook for the first time since his boyhood, the single cramped line a real boy had once written there beside the verse. The private line between a father and the elder son who was truly dead. The line that Winifred had read aloud to the old Duke on the last good evening of his life, and carried in her since. He read it, and then he set the book down, and the silence after it was the silence of a room that has watched a counterfeit coin ring false on a stone. Lady Lockhart rose. She was a brave woman in her way, and she made the last stand her design allowed her, for she had not built a year's careful scheme to surrender it to a parlor trick. She said that this proved nothing, that a left hand could be injured, that a dent could be forgotten, that a margin scribble was no kind of legal evidence against a ship's papers and a captain's seal and a son's own sworn word. She turned on Winifred and said the cruelest true thing she had, that a court would weigh the testimony of a peer of the realm and his returned heir against the word of a dismissed companion, and laughed that the reader's account was worth precisely nothing in the only place such things were weighed. And she was right that the law would not have hung a verdict on a thumb and a margin. She had made one error, however, the error of the confidently wrong, the error of a woman whose script had worked in every drawing-room in England, and it was this. She had built her case for the law, and the test had been set before the family, and a man does not need a court to know his own brother. For the false Valentine had heard the cramped line read aloud, and he had seen in Benedict's shaking face exactly what it meant, that the real elder son had written that line, that the real elder son was as dead as the marble in the chapel set, and that the game was over. And being, beneath the part he played, only Septimus Drane, a clever man hired to wear a dead man's coat and not a cruel one, he set down the dented cup very carefully on the table, as if it had become hot. And he said into the ringing quiet that he was very tired, and that he thought he would not sign anything today. It was confession enough. He looked at Winifred at the edge of the room, the only person in it who had never once been deceived, and something passed over his weathered face that might, in a better man, have been shame. And he did not meet anyone's eyes again. Benedict crossed the room. He crossed it past his aunt and past the solicitor, and past the man who was not his brother. And he came to stand before the reader at the wall, and the whole room turned to watch the cold Duke do the one thing the cold Duke had never done. He took her hand. He held it as if it were the only solid thing in the house, and he turned with it held, so that all of them should see, his aunt and the solicitor and the household and the broken stranger, and into the same room, where his aunt had asked what the reader could possibly know. He said the thing that could not be unsaid. Miss Pelham will be the next Duchess of Harrogate. It was 9 words. He did not make a speech. He had been bred to authority, and he had learned restraint in the hardest school there is. And he knew, as his father had known, that the smallest true thing said plainly in the right room outweighs every loud thing said in the wrong one. He said the 9 words, and then he said nothing more, and he did not let go of her hand. Lady Lockhart did not flee, and she was not flung out. No door of cruelty was opened for her, and Benedict did not open one, for he was his father's son, and his father had taught both his sons that you correct a wrong without becoming one. He told his aunt levelly that her management of the estate during his father's illness would be examined by an honest hand, that whatever was owed would be repaid, and whatever was forgiven would be forgiven once, and that she would retire to the dower property in the south. It was a displacement, not a destruction. She gathered the wreck of her dignity around her in her black silks, and at the door she paused. And she looked back at the reader standing with her hand in the Duke's, and her face did a thing it had never done in all the months Winifred had watched it, which was to acknowledge, for one cold, honest instant, that she had been beaten by the one piece on the board she had not troubled to count. She inclined her head. It was 1/4 of an inch. From a woman like that, it was the whole world. And Winifred, who had been raised to be merciful, gave it back. They did not marry that week or that month. There was the year of mourning to honor, and a false heir to deal with quietly and without scandal, for Benedict sent Septimus Drane away with a small sum and a sharp warning and no charge laid, having no wish to drag his father's name through the assize courts for the sake of a punishment. who had been hired by Lady Lockhart, and had gambled and lost, took the mercy and was never heard of in the north again. There was the estate to set right, the accounts to mend, the tenants to reassure. And there was, between the Duke and the reader, the long, slow work of a man who had spent his life refusing to want anything, learning to want one thing openly, and ask for it plainly. There came an evening, in the first true warmth of the following spring, when the bare oaks of Harrogate had put out their green, and the windows could be left open to the soft northern dusk, and the two of them sat together in the library that had held the worst day of the year, and now held this one. The fire was lit, though the evening was mild, for the old habit of the house was warmth. Benedict had asked her a little stiffly, for he was not a man practiced in such asking, to read to him as she had read to his father, and she had taken up the cracked psalter, her psalter now willed to her by the old man who had armed her with it, and she had read the 121st Psalm in her easy, patient voice. When she reached the last verse, she did not turn the page. She read the cramped line, in the margin too, the private line, and Benedict said it with her, low, from memory, for his father had taught it to him as a boy after all in another life, before grief had made the family strangers to itself. And his voice caught on the same word the old Duke's had always caught on, and Winifred understood at last what the word had meant, and why a father had wept on it, and why he had pressed the book into the hands of the only honest witness in his house. She set the psalter on her knee. Outside the open window an owl called. Once across the darkening park, and was answered. Benedict took her hand, the way he had taken it in the crowded room. But there was no room now and no one to see, only the firelight and the old psalter and the green dusk coming in, and he held it as a man holds a thing he has decided to keep. He did not make a speech this time either. He turned her hand over and looked at the mended seam of her glove, the poor turned glove of a woman the whole world had called only the reader, and he raised it very slowly and pressed his mouth to the worn place at her wrist where the seam had been sewn twice, and held it there, and that was all, and it was everything. If the story of Winifred Pelham has stayed with you to the end of this quiet hour, you might sit a moment in the warmth of it before you go, and remember that the world's first verdict on a person is so rarely its last. The fire settled. The owl called once more across the dark. And in the long library, where a dead man's name had once walked through the door and nearly carried off a living man's house, the reader closed the book at last, with the right verse read and the right line spoken, and laid it on the table beside the dented cup, where the two worn honest things of that family could keep each other company in the firelight. And stay.